Welcome to Pillow Time Lore, a quiet space where stories soften the edges of the day. As you settle into bed, take a slow, deep breath and let it out gently. There's nothing you need to do right now. No to-do lists, no stress, no pressure. Let go of today. The noise, the busyness, the outside world. It can all wait until morning. You've made it through the day. Now it's time to rest. Time to sink into warmth and let your thoughts gently drift like leaves on still water. This story isn't rushed. It doesn't need to be followed closely. It's simply here to keep you company as sleep finds you. So snuggle in, close your eyes if you haven't already, and let the tale begin.
High above the city, on a tall column, stood the statue of the Happy Prince. He was gilded all over with thin leaves of fine gold, with two bright sapphires for eyes, and a large red ruby glowed on the hilt of his sword. During the day, he gleamed like a flame in the sunlight, and at night he shone gently beneath the moon, casting a peaceful watch over the quiet streets below. The townspeople admired him. Children pointed up and smiled. Counselors nodded approvingly as they passed. "He looks just like an angel," one child said. "But why doesn't he ever smile?" the mother whispered, not noticing that his smile was fixed cold, unmoving and silent. But no one knew that deep inside the statue, where once a heart had beat, was a different kind of sadness, a sorrow that lingered like a shadow beneath the gold. The Happy Prince had not always been made of stone and metal. Once, he had lived in a palace where sorrow was not allowed to enter. He danced, he laughed, and he played all day in gardens so perfect they seemed unreal. The courtiers called him the Happy Prince, and happy he was, or so he believed. Now that he stood high above the city, he could see everything: the poverty, the hunger, the pain. What he had once been shielded from now surrounded him, and his heart, though made of lead, wept silently behind those sapphire eyes. One evening, as the sky turned to a deep velvet and stars blinked into being, a little swallow flew over the city. He had been left behind after his friends migrated to Egypt. He was tired, his wings aching from flight, and he sought a place to rest for the night. Spotting the tall statue, he swooped down and nestled between the feet of the Happy Prince. As he tucked his head beneath his wing, a drop of water fell on him. "How strange," he said sleepily. "There's not a cloud in the sky, and yet it's raining." Another drop fell, then a third. He looked up, and to his astonishment, the statue was weeping, great glistening. Tears streamed down the Happy Prince's cheeks, falling onto the swallow like gentle rain. "Who are you?" asked the little bird. "I am the Happy Prince," the statue replied, his voice soft as the breeze. "But I am not happy, not anymore." The swallow's heart stirred with something tender, curiosity, maybe, or a flutter of compassion. And that night, under a golden moon and a soft, sighing wind, something began between them, a story of friendship, of sacrifice and quiet love. The little swallow nestled himself comfortably between the feet of the statue, fluffing his feathers and sighing with relief. "This will do nicely for the night," he murmured, already beginning to drift off. The city below was quiet now, wrapped in the hush of midnight. The warm amber glow from the gas lamps flickered on the cobblestone streets, and the soft rustle of leaves whispered lullabies in the wind. But just as sleep began to carry him away, a gentle sound stirred him. Not wind, not rain, but a quiet sobbing, like a heart breaking in silence. He opened one eye lazily and looked up. The happy prince was crying again. Thick tears rolled down his golden cheeks, glinting like stars as they fell. The swallow, surprised and now fully awake, fluttered up to perch on the statue's shoulder. "Why are you crying again?" he asked softly. "Far below me," the happy prince said, his voice full of pain. "In a dark little house, I see a poor woman sitting by a table. Her face is thin, and she is sewing torn garments by candlelight. Beside her lies her little boy, sick with fever, tossing and turning in his sleep. He is thirsty, but she has nothing to give him except water." The swallow's heart tightened. He looked down at the city bathed in moonlight and imagined the suffering the prince saw. "Swallow," the statue whispered, "please, will you stay with me for one more night? Take the ruby from my sword's hilt and give it to that woman. It will help her buy medicine for her son and food to keep them warm." The swallow hesitated. "It's cold, and my friends are waiting for me in Egypt." But then he looked into the prince's eyes and saw a sadness too deep for gold to hide. "All right," he said gently, "I'll stay one more night." With his tiny beak, the swallow plucked the glowing red ruby from the sword, careful not to damage the golden hilt. It sparkled in his beak like a drop of fire. Then he flew silently over the rooftops, his wings cutting the night air like whispers. When he reached the small, shabby house, he fluttered in through the broken window and dropped the ruby on the table beside the weary woman. She was too tired to notice, but when morning came, her eyes would widen in hope. The swallow flew back to the statue, cold and sleepy, but with something warm blooming in his little chest. "Thank you," the happy prince said, his voice barely a breeze, and beneath the quiet stars, the swallow curled beneath the prince's feet once more, not yet knowing that this night would change him forever. The next night came softly, like a hush falling over the rooftops. The stars blinked gently above the city, and a silver mist clung to the streets like a sleeping breath. The little swallow returned once more to the statue, his tiny heart full of purpose and love. "I am ready again, dear prince," said the bird quietly. "Tell me who needs help tonight." The happy prince spoke slowly, for his voice had grown more tender with sorrow. Far below, in a shadowed doorway, a little match girl sits shivering. Her bare feet are blue from cold, her tiny hands frozen around a few broken matches. She has lost them all, and she dares not return home empty-handed. The swallow looked down at the cold cobbled streets and saw her, small, trembling, lost in the world's indifference. "Give her my other eye," said the prince softly. "Let her sell it for bread and warmth and kindness." The swallow gasped. "But then you will be blind, Prince. You won't see the city you love." "I do not need eyes to see sorrow," whispered the happy prince. "My heart feels what my eyes no longer can, with deep sadness." The swallow gently plucked the second sapphire from the prince's face. Now the statue had no sparkle in his gaze, but his soul seemed brighter than ever before. The little bird flew down to the match girl and slipped the jewel into her apron pocket. She found it, and her face lit up like sunrise over snow. For the first time in days, she smiled, truly smiled. Her hunger was eased, and her hope was reborn. The swallow returned to the prince and curled himself again beneath his feet. The cold wind bit harder than before, and the moonlight was soft like a lullaby. "You should go now, my dear friend," whispered the prince. "Winter is coming fast, and you will perish if you stay." But the swallow only shook his head. "I cannot leave you now, not when you are blind and broken. I will stay by your side, always." And so the days passed, and every night the prince told the swallow of someone else in need. A mother with no food for her child, a writer with frostbitten fingers and no fire, a boy curled up in a crate with a thin cloth for a blanket. Each time, the swallow flew over the city and carried the gold leaf from the prince's body, bit by bit, flake by flake, until no gold remained. The happy prince turned dull and gray, forgotten by the rich who once praised his shine. But the poor below felt his love in every crumb, every coin, every warm blanket delivered in silence. And the swallow, though his wings grew tired and thin, felt happier than he ever had when flying with the other birds. For this was a different kind of flying, a flight of meaning, of kindness, of love at night. The wind howled softly like a lullaby, and the city slept beneath its blanket of snow and stars. But above it all, the prince and the swallow watched over them still, one with no eyes and the other with no fear. Snow began to fall that evening, not with fury, but with softness, like the sky was sighing onto the earth. The rooftops wore fresh white coats. The streets were hushed under thick blankets of silence. Chimneys no longer smoked, and even the stars blinked more slowly, as if the whole world was holding its breath. The swallow lay curled beneath the statue's feet, feathers fluffed, wings trembling with cold. He could hardly feel his toes anymore, yet he did not complain. "I am cold tonight, dear prince," he whispered, "but I do not regret staying." "You have done more than I could ever ask," replied the happy prince, his voice so faint it trembled with the wind. "You gave your wings to my heart, your warmth to my wishes. But is there no one left?" the swallow asked, eyes heavy, but still searching for purpose. No hungry child, no broken soul, no lonely heart. The prince paused. There is one more soul to save. Yours, he said gently. Fly away now to the warm lands you once knew. Rest your wings and live for me. But the swallow only shook his head. How can I live while you remain here, cold and blind, alone in the snow? My place is by your side, always. The wind howled softly, as if mourning something already lost, and the snow began to fall faster, like the sky couldn't hold its tears anymore. The swallow fluttered once, just once, and then grew still, tucked beneath the prince's feet. He had given all he had, not just flight and feathers, but love and loyalty, and a heart that beat for others. And then, something deep within the statue cracked, not loudly, but clearly. The lead heart inside the prince broke clean in two, not from sorrow alone, but from love too strong to be contained. By morning, the city was bright with snow and noise again. Children played in the streets, merchants opened their shops, and the important men walked by the statue with disapproving eyes. Look at this old thing, scoffed one official. No gold, no gems, nothing but rust and stone. Take it down, ordered another. It has no value now. So they tore the statue from its pedestal and melted it in the furnace. But strangely, the lead heart would not melt. It remained solid in the flames, strong as ever. And so they threw it away with the swallow's tiny body to the dust heap outside the city walls. But far above the city, beyond clouds and snow and stars, a different voice spoke. God said to his angels, "Bring me the two most precious things in that city below." And the angels brought him the broken heart of the prince and the lifeless body of the bird who had loved him. "You have chosen wisely," said God, "for in my garden of eternity the little bird shall sing forever in joy, and the happy prince shall dwell with me in golden light, for he gave all he had and more." And so, in a place where there is no winter, no hunger, and no sorrow, they lived on, not as statue and bird, but as soul and song, watched over forever by stars that never fade. The prince turned toward the gate of light, where forever waited. But before he could take a step, the sky rippled not with thunder, like every lullaby whispered to a crying child. It wasn't heard with ears, it was felt in the soul land. It called his name, "Come closer." The prince froze, the swallow bowed his head, wings folded with reverence. The stars blinked slower, the trees leaned in like listeners. Around a storyteller, the prince stepped forward, not out of command, but because every part of him longed to through fields that shimmered not with gold, but with grace through winds that hummed his own forgotten prayers, till finally he stood before a light so bright, yet it didn't burn. It embraced from within. A figure emerged, not a man, not a woman, not anything he could name, just presence. Presence pure, the embodiment of all he had ever sought. justice without judgment, mercy without measure. You knew pain, the voice said, and still you chose kindness. The prince's lips trembled. I failed so many times. The light pulsed softly and still. You tried tears, but not of sorrow, welled in his eyes. Was it enough? The voice did not answer with words. Instead, the sky bloomed midges, danced in the air like stars, remembering who they once were. A hungry child who found a warm meal, a widow who heard laughter after years, a prisoner who saw hope in a bird's flightle. Because he once cared, every act of love echoes, the voice whispered, and yours echoed farther than you ever knew. The swallow soared above them, circling in loops of light. His feathers left trails like stardust, drawing constellations of memory. Then something unexpected happened. The light knelt before him and said, "Even I learn from love." The prince fell to his knees. "Overcome now, rest," the voice said, "not as reward, but as your right." A throne appeared, not of gold, but of petals, prayers, and promises kept. But the prince didn't sit instead. He turned to the swallow. "We still have one more journey," he said softly. The voice didn't stop him because even divinity knows. Some souls are made to serve, even in Pisand. As they turned away from the throne, the skies bowed because not every hero wears a crown somewhere, wings somewhere, robes of sorrow, stitched with compassion, and some simply walk with light in their wake. They didn't return as rulers. Power had never been their true purpose. Their real kingdom was something quieter, something sacred. The memory of their journey softened into something eternal. They came back as gentleness. The prince became the breeze that kissed a lonely cheek, not to remind the world of royalty, but to say, "You're not alone." The swallow became the hush that helped a child fall asleep, a calm presence for tired hearts. They weren't seen, but they were everywhere, in every small kindness done without recognition, in every smile offered without reason, in every act of love that asked for nothing in return. Children who never heard their story still felt safe under stars, because the stars still remembered. Trees stood stronger in storms because something ancient held their roots. And whenever someone stood on the edge of giving up, there was a pause, a breath, a flicker of something warm that was them. Not fixing the world, but reminding it that it was still worth fighting for. They became hope itself. When an old man left food at someone's door, when a young girl gave away her only coat, when someone forgave, even with a broken heart, it was them. And somewhere beyond time, the garden still bloomed, not for the perfect, but for the ones who kept trying, the ones who failed, but still chose love under the tree of time. Two lights glowed, not the brightest, but the steadiest, because their story wasn't made for history books. It was made for hearts. So, if you ever feel warmth on a cold night, or hear a whisper in your mind that says, "You matter," it's them, still here, still watching, still waiting. Not as a prince and a swallow, but as quiet proof that love never dies. It simply finds new voices and stays forever.